thoughts lead to your emotions, and your emotions channel your actions, and your actions can have incredible ramifications on other people. And if you're coming from an environment where ideas impact people, like when we were near the Gaza Strip, right? Like where I grew up, ideas can build amazing civilizations, or they can destroy people.
1 Timothy says this: watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. It's almost like Paul saying, like, the doctrine that you have saves people, which I think you and I would both agree on. And then if you flip over to 2 Timothy, you will hear this, which I think is probably the most applicable verse to this conversation that we're having, which is this. Leading 30 trips to Israel, this is what I see. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. And that, to me, is the whole shebang. I mean, I can't tell you, well, did you hear this guy talk? Did you hear this guy talk? Yes, you can have someone extremely convincingly tell you lies. And I think if you really want to find someone who's just, oh man, that argument sounds brilliant, you can find that guy.
Absolutely.
And that's why I appreciate your YouTube channel, man. So when you're having these discussions with, you want to call them progressive Christians or people that are deconstructing their faith, what do you say back? How do you refute this stuff?
Well, I think we first have to have clarity on what we're talking about. And there's a spectrum there. There's people that have completely gone off the rails. I'll give you an example. I was at this Spotify mixer a couple of years ago, and it was me, it was an artist of mine that was with me, and it was a bunch of folks in the worship community, folks that are writing CCM, the biggest names there in that world. And they were there, and because they wanted to get on somebody's playlists and get better insight information from an editorial playlister at Spotify. So we're all there, we're hanging out, and I'm talking to one of these guys, and he wrote some of the biggest songs from one of the big 3 or 4 like publishing houses. And we're talking. I'm watching his kind of temperament, and we're having this conversation. And I go, listen, I understand that there are certain things that we need to properly reassess about cultural Christianity or churchianity.
Yep.
That's fair. But there are other things that we're just not going to talk about. The resurrection, off the table.
Right.
The scriptures being preserved and inerrant, off the table. And I said, the resurrection, that literally happened. Jesus bodily rose from the grave. That wasn't metaphorical. That wasn't abstract. And he goes, well, maybe it was metaphysical and metaphorical. Maybe it wasn't bodily and literal. And I said, no, see, this is what I'm talking about. We're now coloring outside of the lines of historical Orthodox Christianity. Me and that gentleman ended up going to dinner, and I kept kind of hashing it out. And so these are some of the guys behind the scenes that are writing some of the worship songs that are sung in megachurches. Wow. And these are the things they're thinking, oh, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was abstract. Maybe it was metaphor. And no, it wasn't. That is off the table, right? We don't discuss that.
Hold on, time out. Some of the people writing the worship songs that we listen to in church are not sure if Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave.
One person specifically that I talked to did not know if the resurrection of Jesus bodily happened, and he is at one of the major 3 or 4 publishers that write a lot of the CCLI
That's scary.
music. And there's a huge financial incentive if you know what CCLI is and the publishing side of worship songs, right? So these guys they're making great money, right? And I'll tell you the church offline, but because he's no longer with them. And that is something that is so pervasive, but we also have to nip it in the bud and say, no, let's take you back to some William Lane Craig. Let's take you back to some James White. Let's take you back to some of these other great thinkers that have laid down these foundations that we don't have to question if the resurrection, no, that happened.
Yeah.
And so there's a spectrum there, right? Like that guy's all the way off the rails. And then there's other folks that are like, I affirm the resurrection, I affirm the creeds, but I think we got it wrong on the LGBTQ question. And I go, I think we should look at Romans 1. I think it's fairly clear what Romans 1 says. No, it doesn't mean shameful the way it's shameful for a man to have long hair. That's not what Paul's saying. It is unnatural for this act to occur. And so we have to then hash these things out. So I say that to say, to be fair to folks who have deconstructed, there's a spectrum there. There's folks that have deconstructed essential doctrine, and then there's folks that are struggling through how to deal with their gay friends, and they don't know how to do that. And then there's friends that are struggling with some political and cultural ideology, right? And so, but if we get to the root and get to the heart of the matter, then we can say, do you really have an issue with God? Because if God says, I designed sex for this, you don't get to tell the creator that, nah, I think you got it wrong, God. I think this community over here that identifies as XYZ is able to do whatever they want to, right? And so I think getting to the heart, but also extending empathy that the church has gotten some stuff wrong over the years. We haven't always been spot on in some of these conversations.
And the fact that God would use a Christian rapper to be the voice of clarity and biblical wisdom is just amazing. You know, talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and you could talk about other brilliant apologists, Mike Licona, Sean McDowell, who actually did an entire show with us about the resurrection of Jesus. Mike Licona's book is, I want to say, yay big. It's literally called The Resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus, even Paul says, if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead,
That's right.
What are we doing?
What are we doing?
And the fact that we can even get to that point is scary. Now, we actually met in the land of Jesus, in the land of the Bible, in the land of Israel. So I'm going to take a quick tangent. I'm going to go back to deconstruction.
Okay.
In Israel, was there something that really hit home to you? Was there a moment? Was there something being in the land of the Bible for the first time that a light bulb went off?
The proximity of how far everything was gave me a different appreciation for Jesus's ministry. That these places weren't close. We're driving from the Sea of Galilee to Jerusalem, to the old city. That's a journey, man.
Yep.
In a car, it was a journey.
Yeah.
So I think I got a different appreciation for that. And then I would say the archaeology repeatedly testifying to what we already know to be true, but to consistently show time and time again that Jesus was a historical person, Pontius Pilate was a historical person. These were historical events that happened. So that to me was by far like, wow, this is amazing.
So you and I both live in North County, San Diego. So without saying any names in particular, we have lots of well-known people that are in the Christian space in that area that I've had conversations with who are deconstructing or have deconstructed. And when I talk to them simply about biblical archaeology, you can see the wheels start to turn like, maybe I got this wrong. Maybe this isn't right. And I think a lot of it is emotional. Like, how could God do this? How could God do that? And I think when you start seeing that, and I just had a conversation earlier this morning about archaeology, is that it's not a fairy tale. All this happened. The people, the places, the names of these people, this happened. So really, it's no longer, it would have been a lot easier to deconstruct and reject the whole thing 200 years ago. But now it's like, no, I hear you that it happened, but I'm just going to straight up reject the fact that Jesus is God and he has Lord over my life. So to me, it's almost like people, correct me if I'm wrong, this is going to sound harsh, but people have a political ideology that becomes almost a theology. And when that theology and the biblical worldview starts stretching, maybe 20 years ago, it wasn't stretched as far. But you touch on all the buzzwords. The farther those two things seem to separate, and again, I don't want to get flagged by YouTube, but saying, a man's a man or whatever, it almost seems like you can't reconcile the two. And so I see a lot of people that deconstruct have chosen their politics as their ultimate God. Is that what you see?
I think some have, not all. I think some have genuinely succumbed to the pressures of culture in the world. And if something doesn't make sense to them, or they have an experience that is in contrast with what historical Christianity has taught, and then there's buzzwords and terminology used to dismiss people. So if everything goes back to patriarchy and everything goes back to the system and all these things, and the antidote, in my opinion, to these things is remove America, remove Western culture, Western Christianity, go to Armenia, go to these other places, go to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And what you'll discover is that regardless on where, if you're in America and you're a Protestant, if you're an Eastern Orthodox, if you're an Oriental Orthodox, that's the way I grew up, all of the major arms of the church hold on to the same tenets. So what we don't want to do is deconstruct historical Christianity, because there are places that have nothing to do with the cultural issues here in America that still hold to the resurrection of Jesus. They still hold to a biblical sex ethic. They still hold to all of the tenets of the faith. And they would laugh you out of the room if you said, oh, a man could be a woman and a woman could be like, these are nonsensical things, but we think and conflate that right-wing politics and alt-right ideology and Christianity are, no. Remove everything we argue about in America and go anywhere else in the world where Christianity has thrived or even hasn't thrived, like Syria and Armenia and all these places where it's been under persecution. We all believe the same core essentials. We all believe Jesus is God. We all believe the scriptures is inerrant. We all believe in a biblical sex ethic. We all believe in a virgin birth. We all believe in the same core tenets of the faith. That's the issue, is that we are conflating politics. We are being influenced by downstreams of ideology, from Marxism to postmodernity, and these things are being crossed into our circles. But the issue is the church hasn't done a good job in responding and equipping these things.
You know who has?
Who?
Yeah.
Well, I'm doing my best, but I'm doing my best because I'm immersed enough to understand the areas we didn't properly articulate these things. I'm immersed enough to understand that there are things we could have done better. We could have articulated. We could have engaged better.
I want to ask you a theology question, but first, when anyone meets Ruslan, one of the first things that comes up is, I am an Armenian, and I am super proud to be Armenian. So here's a random factoid if you've never been to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's old city has 4 quarters. 3 of them are very obvious: the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the 4th quarter is
the Armenian quarter.
Why are you so proud about being Armenian? You talk about the Armenian genocide. You talk about what's happening in Armenia today in relation to Azerbaijan. I just want to get your thoughts on that real fast.
Well, Armenia is one of the most persecuted Christian nations. These are the Oriental Church in general. By Oriental, I mean Eastern Orthodox, right? So the Oriental Orthodox arm of the church has experienced immense persecution in predominantly Muslim states, right? So Armenia is one of them. Assyria, the Assyrian church is one of them. And the fact that they've been able to persevere that long is truly a testament for long suffering and being able to, and my lineage is that, the Armenian genocide of 1915 influencing what happened for why me and my parents came out as refugees, and a lot of folks came out as refugees. And so Armenians are naturally a resilient people, but they're a very Christian people. Even if they don't know Jesus personally as Savior, their ethics are very Christian. They're going to stand up. They're going to fight back. And it happened recently in Glendale, where there was a huge protest, and the Armenian population there rose up against some of these school districts and some of the stuff they want to push.
Wow.
And we're like, we're not having it. And it got, because the Armenians they're going to stand up. And so some Antifa folks try to test them, and it got a little, violent.
Wow.
Yeah. So Armenians don't mess around with that kind of stuff.
Don't play with Armenians. Yeah. Well, as you were saying, Armenians, Assyrians, they hold to these doctrines. So here's I think an important question. Why is biblical doctrine, why is theology important? I actually heard, again, you can find people who make arguments that sound legit, or it makes you question, which isn't always a bad thing. But here's basically how this guy said it. He said, so you're telling me you're going to go to hell for having wrong thoughts about God, that just because your understanding of Scripture is bad. He's like, that seems harsh. So why to you is theology and biblical doctrine important?
Well, what we believe is so intrinsic to not just our identity, but it is also intrinsic to how we will behave and how we will carry ourselves. And so all of it is intertwined and overlapped. So to say thoughts lead to your emotions, and your emotions channel your actions, and your actions can have incredible ramifications on other people. And if you're coming from an environment where ideas impact people, like when we were near the Gaza Strip, right? Like where I grew up, ideas can build amazing civilizations, or they can destroy people and cause genocide. So it's not just thoughts. Your thoughts have a downstream effect. Wow. And so the idea of specifically our faith in Jesus is actually us saying we aren't worthy, we aren't righteous, we aren't good. It's Jesus that declares us righteous. It's Jesus that dies and rises for our sins. It's Jesus that creates a pathway. And so that idea is, one, it takes me off of being the hero of the story.
Preach.
I'm not the hero of the story.
Preach.
Jesus is the hero of the story. And then two, that extends a compassion and an empathy to other people to say, but for the grace of God, right? And so if everyone navigated the world that way, we would be in a much better place. If you replace Jesus and everything I just described and you put other worldviews, it starts to fall apart and get nasty really fast. And look at the rest of the world that's in chaos. Look at what's going on in China right now. Look at North Korea, right? There's just some dark stuff happening. Why? It's the downstream effects of a anti-godly worldview. You know, you remove God and authority from it, and then what? The government becomes the authority.
Come on.
The dictator becomes the authority. You could just substitute that. And so there's clearly attempts to do that here in America, but I think there's people that are standing up and pushing back.